The streets of Boston in the late 1760s were restless. Cobbled alleys echoed with the voices of dockworkers, sailors, apprentices, and merchants, men and women who felt the heavy hand of an empire pressing down on their daily lives. Britain's crown demanded taxes, and its soldiers patrolled the city as though it were enemy territory. Tension simmered in every tavern, every market, every gathering of townsfolk. It was a city caught between loyalty and rebellion, between obedience and defiance. And into this charged atmosphere stepped a man whose name history would forever bind to the birth of American liberty, Crispus Attucks. Attucks was no ordinary colonist. He carried within him the heritage of two peoples who knew change and displacement, African and native. Born around 1723, perhaps in Framingham, Massachusetts, his life was shrouded in the silence of history. Records of enslaved men were scarce, and what was known of them often filtered through the eyes of those who claimed to own them. Yet, even in this silence, Attucks emerges as a symbol, a man who lived at the edges of colonial society, neither fully free nor fully enslaved, but always bound by the struggles of survival. By his youth, Attucks may have been enslaved to William Brown of Framingham. A 1750 advertisement in the Boston Gazette described a runaway slave named Crispus, offering £10 for his return. The description fits him: tall, strong, of a very black complexion. Some believe he lived as a fugitive afterward, carving out a life as a sailor and dockworker, blending into Boston's bustling maritime world where labor was always needed. For men like Crispus, the docks were both livelihood and danger. Sailors were often pressed into service by the British Navy against their will, dragged from taverns and streets into ships. For black men especially, freedom was fragile, never fully secure. But Attucks had something few men of his background could openly show: courage. Those who knew him described him as bold, fearless, willing to stand where others stepped back. Boston itself was becoming a powder keg. The Stamp Act of 1765 had sparked riots. The Townshend Acts of 1767 piled on more taxes. Every barrel of tea, every sheet of paper, every glass of wine seemed to carry the weight of royal greed. And when the British sent soldiers in 1768 to enforce order, the city bristled. Soldiers marched down narrow streets, clashing with locals who saw them as intruders. Insults flew. Fists sometimes followed. By 1770, Boston was no longer just restless, it was on the edge of open defiance. And Crispus Attucks, working along the wharves, listening to the talk in taverns, breathing the air of discontent, found himself standing at the very heart of this storm. It was a bitterly cold evening. March winds cut through the streets of Boston like knives. Yet, as the bells of the Old South Meeting House tolled, people spilled into King Street, drawn by shouts and the clang of metal. Soldiers were on the move. A lone sentry, stationed outside the custom house, had clashed with an apprentice boy. The quarrel grew into a crowd, and the crowd swelled into a mob. By the time soldiers arrived to reinforce the sentry, dozens of men were pressing around them, shouting insults: "Lobsters! Bloody backs!" The soldiers' red coats glowed in the torchlight, their muskets gleaming. Snowballs and chunks of ice flew through the air, striking their helmets. And then, through the mass of voices and faces, Crispus Attucks appeared at the front. Witnesses later recalled him standing tall, fearless, a giant among men. He had no musket, no armor, only his presence and his voice. To the soldiers, he was the face of defiance. To the crowd, he was the embodiment of their fury. The tension was unbearable. Soldiers shouted warnings. The crowd pressed closer. Some swore they saw Attucks raise a stick or club in defiance. Others said he simply stood firm, daring the soldiers to fire. And then, chaos. A musket cracked. Smoke filled the air. The first shot rang like thunder against the stone buildings. Crispus Attucks staggered. A bullet tore into his chest, and he fell onto the frozen cobblestones. Blood spread across the snow, a dark stain under the torchlight. He was the first to fall that night, but not the last. For others lay dead or dying by the time the smoke cleared. The crowd screamed in horror, some fleeing, others raging. Soldiers, shaken, stood with smoking muskets, while their captain shouted for order. The night would be remembered as the Boston Massacre. But for those who saw Crispus Attucks fall, it was something deeper, the first blood spilled in the struggle for liberty. In that moment, Attucks became more than a dock worker, more than a fugitive, more than a man of mixed heritage in a divided world. He became a martyr. His blood marked the true beginning of America's Revolution. The morning after the massacre, Boston awoke to grief and fury. Word spread quickly. Blood had been spilled in the streets, and among the dead was a man known to the dockworkers, sailors, and laborers of the city, Crispus Attucks. The bodies of the fallen were laid out for the people to see. Crowds gathered, whispering prayers and swearing vengeance. For a colony already bitter with anger, the massacre was proof that British soldiers were not guardians of peace, but instruments of tyranny. The dead became more than victims, they became symbols. The funeral, held on March 8, 1770, drew thousands. Some say as many as 10,000 Bostonians, nearly half the city's population, lined the streets. The coffins of the martyrs were carried in a solemn procession, draped in black, escorted by mourners of every class. Crispus Attucks' coffin was placed at the front, leading the march. In that moment, race and status mattered less than sacrifice. A man of African and native descent, once enslaved, now led white and black alike into the annals of American memory. His death spoke louder than his life had ever been allowed to. Yet the British authorities were quick to defend their soldiers. Captain Thomas Preston and 8 of his men were arrested and put on trial. The defense was led by none other than John Adams, who would one day be president. Adams argued that the soldiers had been provoked, surrounded by a violent mob. He described Crispus Attucks as the leader of that mob, a man who, in his words, had madly rushed upon the soldiers. Those words cut deep. Even in death, Attucks was branded a troublemaker, a rabble-rouser. To some, he was a hero who stood tall against oppression. To others, he was a dangerous outsider whose defiance brought on bloodshed. But history has its own way of judging. The trial ended with most soldiers acquitted, though 2 were found guilty of manslaughter and branded on the thumb. Justice for Crispus Attucks and the others did not come from the courts. It came instead from memory, from the fire his death ignited. Pamphlets circulated, speeches rang out, and artists sketched the massacre as proof of British cruelty. Paul Revere's engraving of the event showed soldiers firing into an innocent crowd, and though it was not entirely accurate, it captured the spirit of colonial outrage. Attucks' blood, spilled on King Street, became a rallying cry. In taverns and meeting-houses, the name of Crispus Attucks was spoken with reverence. He had been the first to fall, and in that sacrifice, he became something greater than himself, the first martyr of American independence. Years passed, and the Revolution erupted into full war. From Lexington to Yorktown, soldiers marched under banners of liberty, carrying within them the memory of those who had died before the first shot at Concord was ever fired. Among them lingered the image of Crispus Attucks, the man who fell first. In 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed, it declared that all men are created equal. Yet, even as the nation fought for freedom, slavery endured, and men of African descent remained bound in chains. The irony was sharp, but so was the power of Attucks' memory. Here was a man who had no freedom, yet had given his life for the idea of freedom. As the decades rolled on, abolitionists seized upon his story. In the 19th century, writers and activists held up Crispus Attucks as proof that black men had been at the foundation of the nation's liberty. Frederick Douglass spoke of him as a martyr. Abolitionist societies named halls and schools after him. His name was etched into speeches, reminding America that the struggle for freedom was incomplete until all were free. Monuments rose. In 1888, more than a century after the Boston Massacre, A statue was erected on Boston Common to honor Attucks and the other victims. The dedication ceremony drew thousands, including black leaders, who saw in Attucks not only the first martyr of the Revolution but also a symbol of their ongoing fight for equality. Through time, his memory has stood as a bridge between past and present, between the ideals America proclaimed and the realities it struggled to uphold. In schools, his name is taught as the spark of the Revolution. In Black history, he is remembered as one of the first to resist oppression, even when his own life bore the weight of inequality. Crispus Attucks' legacy is not simply that he died on King Street in 1770. His legacy is that his death forced a colony to see the cost of tyranny. His blood became a seed, from which grew the tree of American independence. And though that tree would not bear the fruit of true equality for centuries, his sacrifice remains a reminder that liberty is never free. Generations passed, yet the name of Crispus Attucks refused to fade. His death in 1770 was not buried under the sands of history. It became a touchstone, a reminder that the Revolution was sparked by the courage of ordinary people, dockworkers, sailors, apprentices, men and women whose names were not written into royal ledgers but carved into the memory of freedom. For African Americans, especially, Attucks became a beacon. In a nation where freedom had been declared but denied to them, his sacrifice was proof that they had stood at the birth of the Republic. Every time the story of the Boston Massacre was retold, his face, half forgotten, half reimagined, was placed at the front. He was not just a martyr, he was their martyr, a man of color whose blood consecrated the cause of liberty. In the fight against slavery, abolitionists invoked Attucks' name. They reminded the nation that the very first to fall for independence had been a man denied freedom himself. Speeches thundered with his example. If Crispus Attucks could give his life for America, how could America deny liberty to his descendants? Artists and writers reimagined him. Paintings showed him towering in defiance, leading the crowd with unbreakable courage. Poems praised him as the spark of revolution. Monuments bore his name beside those of men with far greater wealth and privilege. And in the quiet corners of black churches and schools, his story was told to children as proof that their blood, too, ran through the roots of American freedom. Even beyond race, Attucks stood as a symbol of the ordinary man's power. He had no title, no fortune, no command. He was a worker, a sailor, a man of the crowd. And yet, when history demanded a sacrifice, his stood first. His blood gave voice to the voiceless, reminding every generation that freedom is not granted by kings or parliaments, it is claimed by the courage of those willing to stand up. Picture again that cold night of March 5, 1770. Torches flickering, snow falling, soldiers bracing with muskets. And at the front of the crowd, one man steps forward. No armor, no musket, only courage. A musket fires, smoke fills the air, and he falls. That fall was not an end. It was a beginning. Crispus Attucks' death lit a fuse that would burn across 13 colonies, across battlefields and decades, until a new nation stood. His name, once scarcely recorded, became etched into the very foundation of America's story. He was not a general or a politician. He was more. He was the first to fall, the first to bleed, the first martyr of liberty. His story reminds us that history is not only made by those in palaces or parliaments, but also by those in the streets, the docks, the taverns. His courage teaches us that one moment of defiance can change the destiny of a people. Today, when we speak of freedom, when we honor the Revolution, when we raise the flag of independence, we honor also the man who gave his life before freedom had even been declared. A man who carried in his veins the heritage of two oppressed peoples, and in his death, gave birth to the dream of liberty. Crispus Attucks. A name that must never be forgotten. A life that still speaks, across centuries, of courage, sacrifice, and the price of freedom.